relationship as well.
What has been so wonderful? Once you were hit right at the tip, the very essence of cool. Streets heavy and fly, stealing your eye. For you are nobody's fool. It's why I wanna know what you gonna say when they talking down. That chasing you, and someday we'll build it all again.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started in another minute or so. You know the drill. People are off at break. They're getting their caffeine infusion. Hopefully, they will be coming in mass. But in the meantime, this is your chance to come and get front row seats. When does that happen in this auditorium? So do it now or forever hold your peace. But we'll go ahead and get started in just a minute or two. Thanks for your patience. Good afternoon again. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So my name is Samantha Custer. I'm the Director of Policy Analysis for Aid Data, a research and innovation lab at the College of William and Mary. We track who is funding what, where, for whom, and to what effect when it comes to sustainable development. Today, I'm pleased to be discussing, or to be moderating this discussion on the missing millions and data collaboratives. I want to also acknowledge the Global Alliance for Children and the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data for their participation in co-hosting this conversation. Before I dive into what is a fully packed session with a great lineup of speakers, I wanted to provide a little bit of context for why even have this session and what we hope to accomplish through this discussion. So you've heard in the plenaries that the Sustainable Development Goals are the promise of inclusion for those who have been left behind by international development. However, we also know that vulnerable groups are underrepresented in data collection efforts and therefore are, for all practical purposes, invisible to their governments and other development partners that are seeking to allocate resources and monitor progress against the SDGs. In truth, counting these missing millions is a political challenge, it's a policy imperative, and it's also a profound data gap in sustainable development for all. This prompts the question, though, beyond the desire to just be inclusive, why does counting the missing millions matter in practical terms? And what are the costs if we don't do that? As I was reflecting on this question, I thought of just 3 specific implications of the status quo for you. So the first is this: if we don't count the missing millions, we don't have an accurate picture of whether the lives of the poorest of the poor are improving. An estimated 350 million people worldwide are not covered by household surveys. Our statistics could be underreporting the actual experience of poverty amongst the poorest of the poor. And according to the Overseas Development Institute, there could be as many as a quarter more people living on less than $1.25 a day than current estimates suggest. So our statistics are suspect. The second implication is that if we don't count the missing millions, we can't ensure that resources are effectively reaching vulnerable groups. An estimated 15% of the world's population lives with a disability, and 80% of these people live in low and middle income countries. Yet persons with disabilities are seldom explicitly mentioned in development projects, and even if they are, it's uncertain as to whether they are actually benefiting from those resources. According to Aid Data's own research, only 6% of active World Bank projects, for example, explicitly mention disability in their programming, and only 2% of those met our criteria of being truly inclusive of persons with disabilities. So resources being targeted to the vulnerable groups? Not necessarily. The third implication of why the status quo of not being able to count the missing millions matters is that if we don't count the missing millions, their voices aren't heard, or at least they're muffled in advocating for better services and support from their government. According to UNESCO, for example, official enrollment data may overstate the number of children in school at the appropriate age, as they fail to take into account marginalized children that are often undocumented. And, case in point, at present, we lack an accurate number or an accurate estimate of the number of street children worldwide, which I think some of our panelists might hit on later in this session. Okay, so I've made the case in terms of 3 implications for why the status quo is not good enough when it comes to no one left behind and sustainable development for all. And so why are we here at this session at this time? The idea is that we see data collaboratives, which we define as partnerships that cut across public, private, and civil society sectors, as an opportunity to marshal new resources, innovate new approaches to put a critical spotlight on these marginalized populations and ensure that they are indeed counted in efforts to make progress against the SDGs. Over today's conversation, we want to work together with you, and we're a small, intimate group, so none of you can opt out. We're going to make you all work hard in this session, but we want to work with you to think about how we define who the missing millions are, what are the major challenges and opportunities for action, and how do we actually look at some next steps moving forward. And so with that in mind, we'll have 2 opening speakers set the stage for defining the missing millions problem and the role of data collaboratives in that. We'll have a panel discussion that you'll hear different perspectives on organizations that are dealing with this in the real world and what they're learning and what they're experiencing from that. Speaking from the political mobilization perspective, the technical perspective, the resourcing perspective. But we also want this to be an interactive conversation with you. We recognize that many of you also have experiences either working directly with vulnerable populations or at least wanting to work in such a way that your statistics and data are accurately reflecting them. So enough from me. It's time to get a start with the rest of the session. But before I turn and introduce our first speaker, my co-moderator Rick probably circled around the room here, handed out some flyers, and this is the homework. While you're actually listening to what these speakers have to say, as we're engaging in conversation, we want you to jog your thinking about two critical questions. What do you see as some of the biggest challenges that need to be addressed in terms of moving the needle on solving this missing millions problem? And two, what do you see as the most exciting opportunities for action, either based off your own experience or what you've heard from the speakers today? So be thinking about it now as you're going through the session, and then we'll have a portion of a portion of the discussion at the end where we'll actually open it up for everyone. So without further ado, I want to introduce our first speaker. Jenna Slotin is the Senior Director for Policy and Strategy for the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. She's worked extensively on issues related to sustainable development and peace building, with a particular focus on the 2030 Agenda, financing for development, and sustainable development data. She's also heavily involved in shaping the Global Partnership's priority areas of work, including a focus on data to ensure no one is left behind. So Jenna, take it away.
Thank you, Sam and Rick, for inviting me to be part of the panel today, and the Global Partnership is pleased to co-host. Thank you, everyone, for attending the session at 5 o'clock on day 2 of the World Data Forum. I'm pleased to see those of you who joined us today. So I'll just get started. And my role today on the panel is to further set up the context and provide sort of a macro view of how collaboratives or partnerships can begin to address this challenge of the missing millions. I'll touch on a little bit of what's the problem and why does it matter, what needs to change. I'll then turn to what was the impetus to form the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, because it speaks, I think, directly to the challenges that are being tackled by this panel. And then elaborate from that on some thoughts on how to move forward. So I think actually Sam set us up very well on what is the problem and the challenges. First and foremost, I think missing millions is the word missing or invisible. And the Interagency Expert Group on the Data Revolution, which made one famous recommendation, which was to host a World Data Forum. Also, one of its main strong top-level points was the point about invisibility. And we can, Sam actually provided a lot of great data points on that. I think one of the most standout issues is unregistered children and the challenge of civil registration of vital statistics. But so why and why aren't people counted, and what is the political economy of counting different populations and not? So a few thoughts here. In about 10, 12 years ago, I worked in the former Yugoslavia in Kosovo. There hadn't been a census there in just about 2 decades. And there was no party on either end or side of the political or ethnic spectrum that had any interest in conducting a census. Because then they would have actual data that may undermine the arguments they were making about ethnic distribution. So who's interested in actually knowing, and who gets lost in the mix there? I think there are some really important questions to ask. We know, for example, that in DHS surveys, there are only reliable, consistent ethnic trend data, or even a sufficient proxy, in 16 out of 19 countries. Another one, which you'll hear much more about from my fellow panelists, is populations that are structurally left out. So I had a fascinating conversation this morning about children who are outside of family care, and so by definition are not captured by household surveys because they're not found in households. So all kinds of reasons that people may be invisible. What are the policy implications? And we already heard a little bit of this from Sam. Resources and programs are poorly targeted. Issues that are important to the missing millions might be left out. According to the Oxford Poverty and Humanitarian Development Initiative, some of those issues include the quality of work, empowerment, physical safety, social connectedness, and psychological well-being. Another related but closely connected point is input data. So data on how government budget and spending decisions, as well as aid spending decisions, if we're not tracking those according to spending on these missing million populations, we don't have a sense of whether policies and programs that even ostensibly are designed to address their needs are capturing them. So that's another dimension. So what needs to change? One point that I think is important in the theme or imperative to leave no one behind coming out of the 2030 agenda is not just leaving no one behind, but reaching the furthest behind first. That's a very important distinction from the MDGs, where the objective was just to have poverty. And so many of the gains were very understandably from what you might call the lowest hanging fruit. But here we're talking about reaching the furthest behind first as well. And that requires a major set of policy decisions, and it also requires certain types of data and information. So what would that mean, and what would be the implications? So changing that mindset is one important piece. Another that I think everybody at this conference is acutely aware of is the challenge of disaggregation. And there are many people here who are much greater experts than I, but just understanding the challenge of smaller or reduced levels of disaggregation and the challenge of robustness and sample size, but also complexity and cost. So we need to think about what are the innovations at how we can get at more disaggregated data. Who's testing, who's innovating, what are the experiments that are happening, and how can we learn from those? Another element is new sources of data. So we should be asking ourselves, if there are people who are invisible in the statistical record, who might have robust and meaningful data on the missing millions? I've heard a couple of examples even in the last 2 days of non-governmental organizations. Oop, you can still hear me? Non-governmental organizations that have been active in their particular field in a consistent way over decades and have been collecting data on certain populations and may have more robust data in a set of countries over a considerable period of time than the National Statistics Office. And this is not at all a plea to supplant national statistical data, official data, but rather to think about how these alternative sources of data may complement and further bolster what we know about the missing millions. So what does this all come together to mean? Experimentation, new partners, new sources, and I would sum it all up to say collaboration. So that's my pivot to the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. In addition to a World Data Forum, the Interagency Expert Group on the Data Revolution for Sustainable Development also recommended the establishment of a Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data for a couple of reasons. One was to maintain and sustain and push for political attention and investment, continued and sustained political attention and investment in data, cross-fertilization and collaboration across sectors, different data communities, geographies, etc., and breaking down barriers and building up trust across these different actors and sectors and communities. So the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data was launched in September 2015 alongside the adoption of the SDGs. It's a multi-stakeholder network of over 200 partners now in just 1 year from across sectors, including government, private sector, civil society, international organizations, philanthropy, and academia, but also across data communities, so statistics, data science, geospatial data, citizen generated data, and others. And it has three core goals that roughly mirror the original impetus, which is to keep data high on the political agenda, to support multi-stakeholder collaboration, and to really align demand and supply at the country and the sector level between organizations and actors that have data, tools, resources, technology, and those who are looking to address data gaps and challenges. And also to build trust by developing both norms and practical tools for collaboration and innovation that cut across different sectoral and institutional and professional boundaries. So how can networks like the Global Partnership and other collaboratives, as in the title of this session, sort of be positioned to help address data gaps like the Missing Millions Challenge? And I should say that there are many data collaboratives that exist that have coalesced around particular issues, be it gender data or agricultural data or health data. And in fact, many of them are members of the Global Partnership because they see opportunities to collaborate both within their own collaborative and also across. So one is political impetus. So we get more amplification and power the more we work together. I think I heard somebody say this morning, if we can create a political imperative to resolve a methodological problem, often that's what gets it done. When JFK said we're going to the moon, NASA figured it out along with other partners. The second is just fostering collaboration, connecting different actors to test ideas and solve problems that working alone, these same actors would not have achieved or would not have achieved as quickly. And the second, as I said, is this sort of cross-sectoral, cross-country, cross-community learning. And really, the last is building trust. I think understandably, we have many data communities represented at the World Data Forum, people coming from different parts of the world in different sectors that understandably have different ways of working, operate according to different principles, but can and should find ways of working together. And oftentimes the basis of doing so is building trust. So lastly, the organizers asked me about what big bets I'd like to see the international community make in the next 3 to 5 years on the Missing Millions Challenge. I think I would be remiss in not mentioning civil registration and vital statistics. I think that's core and well recognized. I would also, now that I have officially sound like a broken record, would actually say collaboration. And this is the point about different data sources coming together and different actors coming together. There is so much that can be achieved through new and unique collaborations. And then the last one is listening to people. I mean, this is a World Data Forum that's filled with experts. I was listening to a panel yesterday all about perceptions data. And one of the points that was made is, one of the challenges is that government officials, other academics may dismiss perceptions data because they say, well, ordinary people aren't experts, they don't know. But ordinary people are experts about their own lived experience, and it's in fact those who are missing from the record who we need to listen to most acutely. I'm sure some of my other fellow panelists will touch on that point as well. And with that, I'll end. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jenna. I'm Rick Reinhardt, and I'm with the Global Alliance for Children. And together with Samantha, we kind of came up with the idea and put this panel together. But thank you for kind of putting this in perspective in the big overview, and particularly the role of collaboratives, existing, potential for new. And then I think one of the unique things that the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development data offers is connecting the dots between these collaboratives and building trust. And I think there's a reason there are missing millions, and one is that they're really hard to measure, but there's a lot of new opportunities. But so I'd like to turn this over to Meryl Kredich. She's from the Lumos Foundation. She's an advocacy and campaigns officer. She's before joining Lumos, I know she worked quite a bit on vulnerable children in Europe, mainly with Roma populations. And I've had the privilege of working with her for the past year or so, really thinking about children outside of family care and this initiative that Lumos is very involved with, and also, I don't know if you were at an earlier session today, but SOS Children's Villages is also involved, and I'll let Meryl talk about that. But it's all children count, but not all children are counted. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Meryl.
This works now. Thank you so much, Rick, and thank you, Samantha, as well, for giving us the opportunity to speak on this panel. I'll turn this on. There we go. So what I've been asked to talk about is what the missing millions mean for us. And so I will briefly talk about Lumos, the organization I work for, and who the missing millions are for us. And then I will talk about the campaign in a little bit more detail, the campaign that if you were in the plenary earlier, you heard a little bit about from Sofia Garcia. The all children count, but not all children are counted. And then finally, I will offer some thoughts for the future, which hopefully will also be interesting for later on in our discussion. So to start about Lumos, it might be that not many people have heard about Lumos here in the room. We're an international children's organization, and our sole mission is to end the institutionalization of children. So we're trying to prevent children from having to grow up in institution or orphanage settings, and providing family-based alternatives in the community. We estimate that around 8 million children around the world live in institutional care. But speaking of data, this is definitely an estimation. It's hard to measure the number of children who live exactly in institutions for many reasons, one of which is that a lot of orphanages are not actually registered, which causes a big issue. But one thing we do know is that the majority of children who live in orphanages are in fact not orphans. 80% approximately of children who live in orphanages have at least one living parent, and most of these parents, with the right support, would be able to take care of their children. So that is an absolute shame. And so what we know is that the main reason for children to live in institutions is not orphanhood, it's poverty, discrimination, disability, lack of access to services, including inclusive education in the community. So the Sustainable Development Goals provide a very great opportunity to change the lives of millions of children, including children in institutions, as they are exactly tackling these root causes of institutionalization. However, as was mentioned before, as it stands, these children are likely to miss out because we just do not have the means at the moment to know who these children are, to count them, and to measure if they are, first of all, experiencing any development progress, and also to know sort of like exactly what their needs are. So then I would like to turn sort of like, it's not only children in institutions, of course, who are part of this population who miss out because they're not living in households. There are many others. It's street children, children who have been trafficked, children separated from their families as a result of conflict, disaster, disability, children recruited into armed groups, and I'm sure there are other groups that we're not mentioning here. And it's what we know is that a child's living arrangement is a really important indicator for their likelihood to experience neglect, lack of stimulation, extreme or toxic stress, all of which are extremely negative effects on children's health, education, development, and child protection. So we realized this, and several other organizations, including SOS Children's Villages, realized this, and we came together some 1.5 years ago now, and sort of started discussing what are we going to do about this and what can we do to actually change the situation. So we drafted an appeal, sort of a letter outlining what we think the main concerns are, which we presented or launched around the General Assembly when in 2015, when the Sustainable Development Goals were being adopted. Back then, we had some 30 organizations from across the world already who had signed the letter, who supported it. And ever since, the support for the call has been growing, and we now have over 250 civil society organizations from across the world who are supporting the letter and the call. What the letter exactly says, I will turn to now. So what the 250 organizations are calling for data desegregation by caregiving status or living arrangement. Because as I said, a child's living arrangement is such a great sort of indicator for their development. And then also for the need to develop innovative approaches that count development progress of these invisible children. We need to really change the way we count children in order to include the most vulnerable. Because, as you said, we didn't start sort of the furthest behind, and at the moment we're not reaching the furthest behind because we don't know who they are, we can't count them. So we have taken this letter, and we addressed it initially to the Statistical Commission and the Interagency Expert Group on SDG indicators, and we have since also disseminated it to a wider group of target audience. Any UN member state will by now probably have received this letter in their inbox. And we know that it's been received very well, and we've received very positive feedback from the IAG SDGs and members of the Statistical Commission, that they've really appreciated this message and the awareness that we're raising about these missing millions. So we have a very strong movement, and we've really felt that the strength of the group of organizations has been really, really valuable to bring our message across. And in this, we have managed to place an issue on the agenda that was previously not talked about, and to place a group of children on the agenda that we don't know, and we don't know so very little about them, which is in turn one of the major challenges as well. We do really need to develop new methods to count these children, and we need a political will to change it. We need innovation, technical innovation to count them, and we need resources to get this moving. So I think that's what I sort of would like to leave you with, is also the thought of how are we going to get this done. We've raised awareness. We all know about it now. I'm really happy to have noticed that several speakers yesterday and today have already mentioned the fact that these uncounted children need to be counted, but what are we going to do, and how are we going to do this? And I hope that at the end of this forum, we will come away with some strong suggestions and plans to make sure that these children are counted and will become visible. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Meryl, and to Jenna as well. You know, it's striking because you have two speakers that, you know, one is going very broad, the other going very deep. And that's purposeful because, you know, you think about most of the conversations that are happening around No One Left Behind, sometimes it's such a broad catch-all term that it's easy to forget the actual examples of the subgroups of actual communities of people that we're talking about here. And so I think that what Meryl does really well is actually, you know, give us an in-depth look at one of these sub-communities of the missing millions that if we're serious about No One Left Behind, they need to be included as well. I think what Jenna, you know, brought to the table with her discussion is, you know, how do you actually scale up that interest in one particular vulnerable group? Think about it across all different types of vulnerable groups. Connect that to political mobilization, resourcing, standard setting, collaboration, and partnerships. And how do you bring all of that to bear on solving this problem for each of these groups? Now, the panelists that also are here on the table as we kind of shift from our setting the stage to kind of a discussion of what's happening so far, what is clear and consistent, they all focus on different parts of this problem, but collaboration is definitely a common theme throughout them, whether it's collaborating with people around mobilizing resources and political attention around the need for better data for vulnerable groups, or it could be actually mobilizing missing millions in their communities around producing their own data and telling their own story. In terms of leveraging technology and partnering with communities to kind of become visible in terms of where they live and where they're located, and then also thinking about private, public sector collaboration, civil society, kind of getting all of these folks in the room together to talk about what they can each bring to the table. And so I think that's the theme that you will see across all of these different panelists. But why don't we go ahead and I'll introduce them and what we're thinking about, and we'll see, you know, what we're up for at this late stage of the day. But the initial thinking is that I'm going to pose a question to each one. They're going to give a couple of remarks, about 3 minutes apiece. We'll keep it moving to give you an insight into their organizations, the types of missing millions groups that they're focused on in their interventions, but then also come back up after each of those and just talk amongst the panel, talk with you. I'll pose some questions. We'd love to invite some questions from you. Maybe if I can find some people to help me with running mics, or if you just speak up with a really loud voice and project, we can do that too. But for now, let me go ahead and introduce the panelists. So over here, Dr. Rick Reinhardt, Senior Program Officer for the Global Alliance for Children. You met him earlier. His work focuses on the hazards to children and families working in the informal sector and the impact on work-family balance, education, and child development. Davis Adino is DataShift's Senior Advisor for Data Accountability and Sustainable Development for Civicus, World Alliance for Citizen Participation. Davis and his work brings together diverse actors from parliamentarians and civil servants to technology experts and community-level organizations. And he does all of that to develop inclusive information ecosystems and support data sharing and use. And if you don't understand what that means, pepper this gentleman with lots of questions if he does not do a good job of telling you more about it. To this side of me is Rebecca Firth, Community and Partnerships Manager at Humanitarian OpenStreetMap Team. And that stands for HOT. And so when Rebecca starts talking about HOT and forgets to tell you what that stands for, now you'll know. She's not HOT, this is her organization, and they're doing some great work in mobilizing local communities and other volunteers to create digital maps that make it easier for government and civil society organizations to deliver disaster assistance and public services. And last but not least, Phyllis McFarlane is our private sector perspective, critical. Treasurer for the SOMAR Foundation, has also a long career in commercial market research. Her work focuses on applying best practices in quantitative and qualitative measurement to help nonprofit organizations more effectively design and measure their programs. She's currently helping Street Invest, who works with street children globally to make use of all of their qualitative data. So she's our methods guru for sure. So that gives you a sense of who's on the stage with me. We certainly look forward to hearing your perspectives as well. But maybe, Rick, I'll go ahead and pose the first question to you. So, you are working in a similar space to Meryl in terms of this interest on data and measurement for children, making sure that they are counted. As you're reflecting on what Meryl was saying in terms of setting the stage, maybe kind of tell us a little bit more about Global Alliance for Children, how you're trying to tackle this challenge, what you're seeing as most successful thus far in your efforts to mobilize collective action amongst public, private, civil society actors in this area.
Great, thank you, Sam. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll start off, I guess, echoing the problem that we've raised, all the three of you, that there's really been what I would call a silent omission, or maybe it's becoming more visible now for sure. Yeah, I just had a one slide backdrop here. Yeah. So, and then this during an earlier session today, I kind of liked how Sophia Garcia kind of mentioned that there's a lot of children that have just been in a blind spot with a lot of the routine data that's collected globally, and I think it was mentioned a little bit ago, but it's estimated that about a quarter of the poorest wealth quintile are just missed. They're off the statistical map. So there's non-existent data or very weak data on the millions of homeless children or living with often with families, residential care institutions, kind of in the broader category of children outside of family care that we just heard about on the street. And then another area that I'm very interested in are children in hazardous child domestic work, who technically are in families, but I think arguably often outside of family care. So the Global Alliance for Children is a relatively new, we've been around about 2 years, a public-private partnership with donors and public and private foundations and some NGOs. UNICEF is involved. And our main mission in priority countries is we try to work collectively with others to try to move a needle on the number of children growing up in safe, nurturing, and family-based care. So in safe care, essentially trying to move a needle on reducing exposure to violence and exploitation, abuse, nurturing care, focusing on increasing the number of children reaching age-appropriate developmental and growth milestones. And then the third is, family care. And a lot of the focus is on essentially reducing the number of children outside of family care. And that's really where this has been quite a challenge. And just as a quick example, we are kind of a backbone organization of a multi-sector, multi-donor collective impact project in Cambodia called Family Care First. And one of the goals that came from the community is to reduce the number of children in institutions. And a year ago, the administrative data that the country had suggested there were about 12,000 children nationally. Some work that USAID funded with Columbia University and the National Statistics Office kind of put that number up to 49,000. And then just recently, the Ministry of Social Affairs did a mapping, and their estimates are somewhere in the middle. So if you're trying to look long term, what's happening in this population, there's a lot that's being done right now, and it's creating, these numbers are creating dialogue, but there's a lot more to do. So, I think what we're planning to do, along with Lumos and SOS Villages and others, is to really try to create a dialogue and expanding the data revolution to make sure that all children are essentially counted and that we have information on them.
Great, thank you so much, Rick, for that. Now, Davis, I know that Civicus and DataShift is all about citizen-generated data. And what I think is interesting and what I'd love to hear more from you about in this question is that, when we're talking about the missing millions or leave no one behind, you hear the term counted. That implies a certain passivity, if you will, on behalf of the missing millions populations. And so I guess my question for you is, in the realm of citizen-generated data, how realistic or feasible is it that the missing millions themselves and or the communities where they live can be partners in making sure that we're actually measuring and counting this community? So.
Thank you so much, Samantha. I think this is a great opportunity for us as Civicus World Alliance and the Data Shift to speak to all of you about these issues. And I think for us, really, like I was saying yesterday at another panel, there is a convergence in terms of the narrative around the missing millions, leave no one behind, multi-stakeholder ecosystems, and the need for people to really come together to try and solve the problems that we are facing and the challenges that the SDGs actually present to us. I think one of the things that needs to happen if we are going to talk about the missing millions, the first thing is to try and discount the notion that these missing millions, all of them, if not majority, are passive, participants sitting there just waiting to be heard. I think it's important to understand that all over the world, people are struggling. They're striving to make a living. They're struggling to try and solve the problems that face them on a day-to-day basis. People don't want to sit and wait for government to try and resolve all the challenges they have. And that for us presents an opportunity to say, instead of thinking about interventions that solely focus on, let's go into the community, let's try to solve the problem, we need to critically think about models that strengthen the capacity of the communities, to do what they can actually do at the local level. But that does not in any way, give governments the excuse not to deliver on their mandate. Of course, we have to draw the line that looking at the SDGs agenda, for example, it's quite ambitious. And there are targets and indicators out of the 230 and counting that if you closely look, there's something that citizens can actually do. But the role of government is therefore to come and identify what is it that citizens can do at the local level, what is it that government then needs to do to plug into the gaps or support the community, to try and find solutions that work for them at that very local level. And I would say for us, we focus on the citizens, we focus on civil society because they are the front line of where these issues matter the most. And we are learning that if you provide the necessary capacity and necessary tools, people are able to use mobile phones across the world, even to collect data. It's about them understanding and seeing the value in terms of data, information. Is it enabling government to come and see us as the missing millions? Is the data providing the right information for solutions to be found that can then solve our problems? And I think that's the narrative, and people want to see action. People want to see solutions. People want to see services. So the more the data on the missing millions, and we engage them in strengthening their capacity to raise their voices as part of the missing millions, then there's going to be a huge opportunity for us in the next 14 years or so for the SDGs to rally everyone behind the agenda and make sure that they're active participants.
Great, thank you so much, Davis, for those words. So I'm going to turn now to Rebecca, who similarly to Civicus is also very interested in looking at crowdsourced information, working with communities to have them involved in mapping where they live. But I also know that Davis alluded to this a little bit, but you have this unofficial data that's being produced, and a lot of people here at the conference, and I didn't do a straw poll of the room here, but, a lot of people that come from the statistics world, that come from official producers of data, they look at askance at this unofficial data in terms of the quality, in terms of the reliability and relevance. And I know that you guys have been thinking a lot about this in terms of what is the nexus between official and unofficial data? When can they play nicely to give us a broader picture of this missing millions problem?
Thank you. So I might just quickly talk about what sort of the missing millions problem means to HOT before covering off that question. So really exactly what you see on this slide is what missing millions means to us. So there's loads of places in the developing world which just don't appear on digital maps or don't appear in any level of detail. This is a very stark example. You also find kind of pockets within cities which may be absent from the map. And this is a thriving trading town of 120,000 people. It's a port town. And you can see it's just not on Google Maps. You would just think that this is a place that is connecting to other locations. But actually, after about 70 people spent about 3 hours at one of our mapping events, mapping this remotely, the event was in London, then you can see this really complicated fabric of the city appearing. So if you're trying to work in this location and you're a government doing policy, you're an NGO trying to deal with a cholera outbreak, the map on the right-hand side really does not give you the information that you need to be able to logistically respond to that, let alone go into kind of the measuring against the SDGs, like how are you going to measure water and sanitation in this place if you don't know where all the buildings are? So this kind of view is really sort of exactly what missing millions means to us. So in terms of kind of trying to work with unofficial and official data sources, this is something that HOT is really doing very successfully in a number of locations. We have a lot of kind of collaboratives and partnerships projects set up where we do this. And to us, it's really about breaking down the tasks which can be completed by a crowdsourced volunteer and what the official data sources need. So we try to work really early on with governments, national and local governments, on the data that they need and what is currently missing, and kind of break down different tasks that can be kind of done at a mass scale very quickly by a remote volunteer. So for example, the tracing of kind of a building in satellite imagery is not a hard task. It's something that, hundreds of thousands of remote volunteers are able to contribute to, and it leads to all this sort of later benefit for official data sources. But likewise, there's other tasks which we would get sort of an on-the-ground volunteer to do, so somebody who lives and works in that place. And then there's other things which are appropriate just to be done by an official data source. So where we kind of try to get the greatest benefit is sort of harnessing this huge capacity of the unofficial data producers in appropriate contexts and trying to kind of, get as much benefit as we can from them to make life easier for the official data producers and data sources.
Great, thank you so much, Rebecca. I think it was on a phone call earlier as we were preparing for this. You had a turn of phrase, and I'll probably botch it, but that it really stuck with me. And it's this question of like when you're thinking about official and unofficial data working together, how do you actually use the official data to direct how unofficial data is collected so that it effectively is complementing and augmenting the official record? And I thought that was actually really, rather than just assuming these things are happening in isolation and in silos, they're actually working together, which I think is great. In a similar way, Phyllis, I know that you are very passionate about making sure that we're looking at the whole picture. We're looking at the numbers, the statistics at a disaggregated level, but we're also not limiting ourselves to that. We're looking at qualitative information. We're thinking about how this all plays together. And so, would love you to kind of talk a little bit about the SMR Foundation, some of the collaborations you're doing with other actors where you're trying to broker these relationships, working with public, private, civil society sectors and encouraging them to make use of all of the data to make sure these folks are counted.
Yeah, it's quite a problem. When I first came to this, I thought to myself, I'm a market researcher, I know how to measure things, I know how to solve this problem. And then you look into it and you realize, wow, this is really quite difficult. And I think, before I get into the other aspect, one of the main barriers here is to get people to accept unconventional ways of measuring. And doing it in multiple ways, triangulating, bringing data in from different sources, just as we've mentioned, Davis and Rachel have mentioned, and then coming to a best estimate. Because if we sit here saying, oh, it's too difficult, it can't be done, then we're never going to get anywhere. And I've been working, as Samantha said, with Street Invest, and they actually have a method of counting street children, which is accredited and is acknowledged to be the best method possible of counting street children. It's quite complex, it takes a lot of effort, and I'm working with them to try and perhaps get them more resource, because the market research industry is good at collecting data, getting them more resource to perhaps the next task is to measure the number of street children in Calcutta. They've done Sierra Leone. I think Calcutta might be an even greater problem, but I'm trying to help them do that. So basically, I'm coming at this as, you say, a private sector person with an industry, the market research industry, that is good at counting and is also good at understanding. So several people in lots of sessions I've listened to have talked about disaggregation. And what most people here mean by disaggregation is splitting by gender or age or living conditions or whatever. What I mean by disaggregation is really talking to the people, listening to the actual people, consulting, finding out what they want in a qualitative and ethnographic way. I must find an easier word, I keep mispronouncing that. So that we actually have the voice of the people telling us what they need and want, so that when we've got a number, we'll be able to look at it in terms of what those people say they want us to do to help them live their lives in a better way. So I really can, I believe, bring that resource to your world and help you do this. But there has to be an acceptance in the world both of unconventional methods of counting and that qualitative and ethnographic data has value and is useful and will help direct real action-oriented plans that they will accept. Because there are too many examples, I think, of people going in with well-meaning plans but that don't necessarily meet the children's needs. And Street Invest tell the story of Father Patrick, who set it up something like 20 years ago. And at that point, the idea was get these children off the streets, get them into school, then they'll be all right. And one day a little boy tugged at his habit and said, "What are your schools for, Mr. Patrick?" And he thought, that's a very good question. What am I actually trying to achieve? And since then, he moved on to actually supporting the children growing up in the streets rather than telling them what to do. So, and that's much, much more useful. So if I may go on a little bit, one of the things that we've learned from the research that we've been doing across various market research agencies is working with the homeless and with other disadvantaged groups, is one of our main problems is that they're not only invisible to the national statistics offices, they're also invisible to the general population. And a lot of people say, oh, it's no good worrying about street children. They want to live on the street. They're Roma, they're gypsies, they like it that way. Or it's no good giving them money, they'll spend it on alcohol and drugs. And I say, well, wouldn't you if you were in that situation? And I think one of the big bets we've got to make is to spend money changing the public perception of these groups. And then not only will they be easier to count, but it'll be easier to help them, I think.
Great, thank you, Phyllis. And I think that that actually syncs up very nicely with something that Davis said about making sure that we actually change our thinking and our view of these groups, and instead of viewing them as passive actors, they're partners in this data collection exercise and advocating for better services. So I gave these guys a whole...
Can I interrupt you? I mean, it is quite remarkable how in surveys people dehumanize them. They actually don't believe they are people, and therefore they can be treated badly. And if we can't get over that, then we're never going to get anywhere.
Great. No, that's exactly right. And we'll dig into more of this in the discussion. But so I gave these guys a round of softball questions to get us started. Now it's time to dig a little deeper so we can actually go beyond the things that we always say in these panels and these discussions, and actually talk about what are the real sticking areas, what are the things that are most difficult to do. I have a bunch of questions for this, but I'd also like to open up the floor to you. And so what I'm going to do, as you have a question or a comment or an insight, go ahead and raise your hand, and I will try to acknowledge you when I catch your eye. If we have people that are able to run mics, now would be the time to assist. If not, I'll just ask you to speak up really loudly. But so I will sprinkle in questions, you as well. I think I saw a hand in the back. Is that right? Okay, a couple of hands. Okay, so why don't we take a question from the floor first, and then I'll pose a question. This lady in the purple, can you introduce yourself, please? And then ask your question. And I think a mic is coming to you. Thank you so much for your assistance. We're making her exercise today. This lady in the purple.
Yeah, I'm Joanne Carling. I am an indigenous person from the Philippines and working with the Indigenous Peoples Major Group on the SDGs. I think, as you know, most of us actually belong to the missing millions. The present data, for example, shows that we are 5% of the global population, but 15% of the poor. And we believe that we are actually underestimated in the 5% calculation, because a lot of us are not legally recognized at the country level and thereby are not included in any statistics that refers to ethnicity, and a lot of us don't even have citizenship in the countries where we belong. It's not just, we're not just registered, but we don't also have the citizenship. So that's one. Now, in relation to what I think are the challenges, as you pointed out clearly, one is the political will to do data disaggregation on ethnicity, because if that is not done, we will forever remain invisible. And our specific issues, our concerns, and more importantly, our rights that are actually recognized already under international human rights standards is not going to be respected. And so that's one. And we recognize that one of the biggest challenge in doing data disaggregation on ethnicity is resources. And that is where we need also the political will of states to provide those resources, but also to have partnerships with us. And I fully agree with the point that we need the collaboration, we need the active participation of those that are missing to be the ones that will also generate the needed data, because we know our situation, we know what the SDGs are from our perspective. And that is one thing that when we do not participate, like for example on the issue of poverty, that is a big lesson from the MDG, that poverty has multi-dimensional issues. It's not just about income. So from the perspective of indigenous peoples, being dispossessed from our lands and resources is poverty. Even if we have an income of $1, that's not how we measure it. So it's also how do we account for the specific perceptions and views of those missing on how the way they interpret the SDGs. And I think we need to find innovative means to bring those data out, ensuring that those missing are providing that information. And finally, just to mention that we are willing to partner and collaborate with other organizations on sharing the data that we ourselves generate, and we have already taken initiatives on this. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that. So just to kind of capture a couple of strands, because there was so much wonderful insight in there. So one of the things, so definitely, I didn't mention that in my opening because I only had so many times, but yes, ethnic groups, ethnic minorities, certainly, you know, an area where you see a lot of less documented groups. I think that's critical to include. I think that your point about the fact that we need to not only think about perceptions and views of vulnerable groups, but think about the perceptions and views of vulnerable groups about the SDGs and how they interpret that and how they prioritize amongst that agenda is really key. And I think that's probably something we haven't talked very much about, and I think that's right on point. I think that the earlier piece that you mentioned about political will, I think that, you know, Jenna nicely alluded to this in her opening remarks. I've talked a lot with Davis about this in terms of the work that they're doing. I'd love to kind of maybe hear an immediate reaction from Davis and Jenna, putting you guys on the spot, but then others, feel free to chime in. You know, as you think about the very good point that this lady mentioned and Jenna mentioned at the start, which is, you know, it's all well and good to count the missing millions, but what do you do if governments just don't want to do it? And what have you found to actually work in those conversations?
Yeah, thank you very much for that fantastic question. I think for us as Civicus World Alliance, we do recognize we are quite strong on human rights, and the issue of indigenous people is quite strong on our agenda, because we do recognize that there are a lot of serious human rights violations that go on across the world regarding indigenous people. I would say there are three categories of, you know, the missing millions, if I was to, you know, try and categorize. You know, there are those that are missing basically because either governments have limitations to reach them, for example, street children, you know, or pastoralists that, you know, during censuses cannot be reached, or indigenous people who may be in locations where there are certain challenges to reach, or in marginalized places. For example, in northern Kenya, we see a lot of, you know, very rough terrain that makes it difficult sometimes for government to just get to the people. So there's that category of missing millions. And then we have a second category of those who've been deliberately left out. And this includes the indigenous people, sometimes for either environmental or political, you know, reasons, or political opposition. You know, in a lot of developing countries, if you are not supporting government, you simply don't get the resources or government services. So you're deliberately left out, and in that case, then you become marginalized, and you form part of the missing millions. I think the third category is those who are missing because they actually want to be missing, you know. And I think it's important to critically think about, are there people who actually don't want to be counted for one reason or another? And that's something for us, you know, food for thought. Are there people who essentially think that if they're counted, either they'll be persecuted or there will be some sort of repercussion in terms of being counted, or they simply don't see the value of being counted? If you're coming around, you know, with your census and you never get back to me and you try to solve my problems, the next time you come to look for that data and information, you know, I'll think it's a disruption to my, you know, to my life, and I'll go missing in action, MIA. So we need to think about those different categories and, you know, look at critically how do we start engaging people to see the value of being included? Because it's one thing to be missing, but If you know you're missing and if you're counted, then there is an opportunity. You'll strive to get counted. But if you're missing and you don't see any opportunity, then it becomes very difficult even to make yourself available to be counted, because ultimately you don't see any use.
Jenna, would you like?
So I guess what we're fundamentally touching on is the relationship between citizens and the state, which is a much bigger, broader, deeper, more complex question than maybe what we're gathered here today. So, you know, we can't resolve that, but I think Davis makes a number of incredibly important points. Also, just to say to the lady who made the point, as a Canadian, I'm acutely aware of the challenges and the invisibility in some cases of Indigenous peoples coming from a country that admittedly has come a long way but has a lot further to go. What I'd say also from experience in the example I gave at the beginning of my remarks from my experience in Kosovo and the former Yugoslavia, where these were incredibly delicate questions. And there was a large international presence there, so it was unique in many, many cases. But, you know, the colleagues from UNFPA, began asking themselves, okay, so the census is going to be incredibly politically sensitive. There's no way that that's going to move anytime soon. So they began to put together the ingredients to do a demographic and health survey. And the arguments were around, you know, just delivering services in an environment where a complete rebuilding of a state administration needed to take place. And in fact, that is not a replacement for a proper census. We all know that. But that is one example of how numbers started to come, and over time, with that and other exercises, I worked for UNDP at the time, and we were working precisely on this question of local governance and the relationship between the state and citizens. And we did a very simple survey of people's perceptions of local government and the delivery of services, and compared it by municipality. And you have to ask some basic demographic questions in order to, slice up your data. So over time, as the situation changes and as you do other sorts of work to gather data, gather information, I think it's possible to start to find ways and entry points to get at some of the political questions, so long as you're properly sensitive to them. And I'm by no means suggesting that these sorts of things are going to change overnight. We know there are many populations that have faced these challenges and continue to do so today, but those are some ideas.
Great. Sorry, Jenna, for accidentally nicking the mic there. Just a favor to our friends up in the control booth. We're getting some background noise, so I don't know if it's coming from there or from outside, but if you could help us just close those doors, that'd be great. Sorry about that. So great points from the panelists, great intervention from the audience. I saw some other hands earlier, other questions or immediate reactions that people have. Oh, okay, somebody in the back, yes, with the hand raised, please, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Semia Gharbi from Tunisia. I represent WIDO, World Women Environmental and Development Organization. My question is about the partnerships on SDGs. In reality, I'm a little bit, not a little bit, but I'm scared about the destination, the final destination of Agenda 2030 could be the same as the MDGs, because the time is running fast and 2030 is just tomorrow, 14 years, and we're still now at the earlier stage, looking for connection, seeing other issues, and now we have to urgent for an act. So as I am academic and I'm expert in environment, I think we have to look for an harmonization thoughts or plan. and the only harmonized system is to be scientific tools. So just we have to start with this. My second point is, in my point of view, missing millions for me is don't fit what we need. It is missing life, because life doesn't have price. So we need to think about life of people. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And does somebody else have a mic already? We could take another question. If we could bring the mic down to this gentleman over here, that'd be great. While that's happening, maybe, so just to rephrase or to kind of distill what that great intervention was. So I heard three things, actually. I heard what is the relevance of the SDGs really in terms of, the targets, the goals, the indicators, they're out there, but where are we actually going to end up? We know that with the MDGs, some things were achieved, some things weren't. We actually, need to think about scientific tools to measure these things, but then also to set realistic expectations. There was an element about partnerships in terms of how do you actually get partnerships together to, in a meaningful way to work seriously towards the goals. And then also this question about the terminology, whether missing millions, referring to the number of people, if that's kind of dehumanizing people again, by not actually focusing on lives and livelihoods. So all really great questions. Does the gentleman over here have a mic too? Why don't you go ahead and ask your question, and then we'll throw out some to the panelists. Please go ahead and state your name too.
Yes. Good evening, everyone. I'm Kabengele from Brain to Reach African Child. It's a free counseling project which we established in South Africa. We assist children mental affected by social issue. My question, if you guys missing, which is coming to you, is did you guys already identify the sector which is a number of children are not counted? If it's that you already identify, which one can know? Because I'm living as a migrant, I was a refugee, right now I'm a migrant. Because according to our program and our researches, we've provided some information to some of the organizations, but until now, there's 1,000 of children who are not in rural area, but in urban area and cities, but they have a birth certificate, they're not registered, they're not going to school. So I want to know you guys, what you to provide to such people, and then that was my question. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much for that. So if I understand correctly, I think you're asking us to go a little deeper in terms of explaining what we're seeing when it comes to the missing millions when in children. Is it in certain sectors that we're seeing this particularly? What does that look like? So I guess a couple of things for the panelists to think about, and I might add in okay, I see your hand too. So there was a question about, tell us more about what this, what it means across sectors for when we can't actually count children. What does this look like? Are there particular sectors where this is, actually coming out in a more prevalent way? Perhaps Meryl can kind of intervene on that one for us, and perhaps Rick too. I think on this question of scientific methods to be able to monitor progress towards the SDGs. How do we get serious about this? Perhaps Phyllis, that would be something you can tackle from your perspective in terms of like, what can if the SDGs is about more than governments and donors participating, what can the private sector do to help kickstart some of this? I think also I'd like to hear your perspective on that, Rebecca, in terms of saying, what is the role of civil society? How do you actually lower the barriers to entry in terms of getting traction if you have a wider set of actors? And then this question about missing millions, missing lives. Are we getting the terminology incorrect? And I think actually having Rick speak to that would be great. So why don't we go ahead and start with Meryl on down, and then if you're inspired to tackle another part of the question, feel free to do so.
So if I understood correctly, I think that the children that we're talking about, and I think any of the children and the people that we're talking about that are not counted, I think they are facing disadvantage across all sectors, and I think it is the lack of information sort of amplifies that. We don't know exactly the disadvantage in each of the different areas of life that they face in specific sort of facts, just because we cannot or we don't have the information now available. And I think what we've heard on the panel and from the speakers, sort of the innovation that exists and the new means that exists to actually find where these children are, who they are, and what their lives are like. I think that is such a great opportunity, and I think what's really important is that the unofficial data that we gather from that is going to be used in a very meaningful way to also input the official data and like be used by national statistics officers to actually inform how they are taking next steps to gather the official information. If do you want to add anything?
I guess I'll give it a shot. And actually, maybe I'll start just quickly on the scientific methods bit, and because one of the big challenges with this quote, missing millions, are definitions from a measurement perspective, and there's been a lot of work, but probably not as much work as some of the other populations of vulnerable people where there are better data captured. Like, for example, the term street children means a lot of things to different people, but there are a lot of, and some studies have shown like 80% of children you see on the streets or working on the streets actually do go to households at night. Then there's other categories of street children that are part of homeless families and others that are just alone. And then same with residential care institutions. Where does the line draw between a boarding school and a residential care institution and other things? And these become real challenges. And what you end up with, and a lot of the work that's been done to date are sort of one-off studies, so very innovative methods. There are methods to shine light on a lot of these populations, but they're usually, if they're funded by donors, they're one-off, and another challenge, I guess, for these scientific methods to become more mainstream is that, we're talking about a huge segment of the population, or not huge, but a substantial segment of the poorest of the poor, arguably, who are missed, but they cut across all the SDGs relevant to children. It's not, or people. It's not just one SDG, so to speak, and usually the way funding flows is, in a sector-based way. So there's a lot of challenges, and I think, maybe to touch on the sort of human element, it's not that the SDGs apply to the non-missing millions as well. I think there is a very sort of human element, but I think the point here, if truly a quarter of what we're calling the P20, the poorest, or the poorest wealth quintile, are just off any statistical map, or sometimes there are administrative data that maybe captures some of that, but usually that's very poor in developing countries. That's a big deal, and there's a lot of, I think, opportunity to sort of bring that, and then there's a lot of things happening at the country level, and I gave Cambodia as an example, and there's some resources to do some really cool things. So, I think that's another sort of opportunity to bring in ways to try to move this forward.
So just wanted to maybe reframe my question for you two, because I was thinking about where you're coming from for your organization. So kind of picking up on the theme that Rick was sharing. So diffusion of some of the innovative methods that you're talking about. We kind of alluded to this earlier. So like part of this question about diffusion of scientific methods is also the political will, not only of governments, but NSOs, national statistics agencies, other parts of government that are, and the UN system that are charged with collecting data. As you've been dealing with some fairly experimental, innovative approaches, what kind of diffusion are we seeing there? And then also this question about, what are the ingredients that you've seen to public, private, civil society sector partnerships that actually work around data? Because, to the point that was raised, there's a lot of talk around this area, but not a lot of action. And part of that is actually getting something that works on all sides.
I was thinking that the Global Partnership's been doing roadmaps, and that's been basically targeted at countries achieving the whole of the SDG range. Could we not do a roadmap that cuts across and to achieve solution of this and integrate in with the country roadmaps? Because I can see that we can work with a certain number of people who already have the political will, but I think the question of bringing on board those who don't have the political will is going to be quite thing. So could we not get the main NGOs together and do a roadmap and see what it would mean to take these methods through the whole of the globe? Yeah? Let's be ambitious.
Yeah, and just to kind of chip in on that then, I really kind of agree with your point that there is so many indicators and so many SDGs that we need to monitor, that we really do need practical solutions to do that very quickly. So with OpenStreetMap, that really provides the basis against which it is easy to measure a lot of these indicators that otherwise, sort of without that framework and without that kind of spatial impact, like information, it's really difficult. So in terms of kind of lowering the barriers for people to do that, that's something we really actively try to do through our community. So for some of our specific projects, we do a lot of local community empowerment and community training, where it will be students, volunteers from the community who are sort of taking that information and kind of making the maps of their own places. But we do also try to make as much of it as possible available online so that anybody can just pick it up and ask us questions sort of as and when they have them. But one of the things that HOT specifically has realized recently has been a problem is that there are barriers to entry to people who are trying to do this. So we actually this year are setting up a microgrants program. So we've got kind of a budget where we'll give kind of very small sort of ad hoc microgrants to communities who are really trying to, practically collect the data that they need, but they just need something really small, like a few GPS devices or access to Wi-Fi or something that we can support them with. So we're sort of hoping that through that program we'll be able to demonstrate how sort of very small grants to groups of people who are trying to work for a kind of specific SDG goal will make a big difference in the data that's available for measurement.
I think we'll just move on just because of the sake of time. I just wanted to make a brief note that since we started quarter past instead of 5, I think it's okay if we roll over a little bit. And so with that in mind, maybe we'll go till 6:45. We could take 1 or 2 more questions, and then we'll try to wrap up. So I think there was a gentleman here. I think he has a mic. Any other people with additions that they want to add? They want to signal for the mic. Okay, go ahead, please.
Hello, Alexio Nestor, Save the Children UK. I was very interested by the remark on ethnicity. We actually at Save the Children UK, we have a data set we call GRID, where we have processed a lot of data from DHS and MIX, and we have data on core child indicators, health, nutrition, education, disaggregated by ethnic group. I can talk more about that with people who are interested. We are just making this data available online. And this is something that, it's a very new project for us. We're just launching it. If some people want to talk about it, I'd be interested to talk about it. But I mean, something I want to tell to the panel after some self-promotion is what we see in GRID is when you disaggregate by ethnic group, very quickly sample sizes are too small. So we need bigger data set. Bigger data set probably means more money. The missing million is a big problem. I'd say we reckon it's a big problem. We want to try to solve it, but it also requires much more money if we want to solve it. I know there is political will is important. I know there can be some innovation that can be important, but I can't imagine that it will be possible if we don't increase the amount of funding. I think in this table there is no donor, there is nobody with really money. So I'm maybe asking the panel, where do you think are trade-off? I mean, for me, this is maybe one of the most important things that we need to do for the SDGs to solve this issue. If we do that, what don't we do? Are there some trade-off? We don't really talk about trade-off in this conference. We don't really talk about new source of fundings. Are you hopeful that there can be other source of funding, and where are they? Where is the money? Thank you very much.
That's an excellent question. So effectively, once you start doing one thing, if there's a set amount of resources to work with, that effectively has a displacement effect. And so, you're absolutely right. So as we're doing this, what are we not doing? Any other questions that people want to raise? Okay, I think that's a great one, and I think that just an immediate reaction from my perspective, and then I'd love to hear what others on the panel have to say. I think it depends on what we're talking about. So there's some aspects of this problem of counting the missing millions that you actually can start to capture in a fairly low cost, minimum disruption kind of way, and that could be changing the standard fields that we include in existing large-scale data collection exercises, whether they're official ones or unofficial ones, like actually thinking systematically. So we've thought about this from the lens of, I mentioned in my opening remarks about this pilot project that we did on tracking financing for development for persons with disabilities. And that involved creating a new methodology, but that could be done, there's an investment up front, but once you actually establish a set of codes, establish certain fields, you can graph that into, if that becomes a standard and everyone's using it, then all of a sudden you're starting to get some disaggregated information on who's benefiting, at least from the input side of things. You could carry that over into the outcomes. Of course, now you have to think about what that looks like for other vulnerable groups. I think the bigger question that's kind of underlying what you're mentioning is coverage. So, like when you're talking about household surveys that just aren't even hitting these groups and what it would take to actually be able to reach them, or, vulnerable groups that aren't even documented or registered. So to Jenna's point about civil registration, it's thinking about some of those that would take an exertion of effort for sure. I'd love to hear, just anyone on the panel that has immediate reactions as you think about, one, this question of, are there, do we buy this argument that this is like too costly and too expensive to do? Like, are there things that we can leverage, better, new technologies, new methods to be able to do pretty cost effectively? It's the low-hanging fruit. But then the broader piece on coverage where, there is ultimately a point where there's going to be an expenditure to be able to reach some of these unreached groups. How do we have those conversations? Who is willing to pay for that? How do we do it? So love to hear any thoughts on that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think I have a few things I want to say on that. I think, firstly, we need to, before thinking about everything that we can't do, because it's too costly or too difficult, I think there's so many good examples of like innovative ideas and creative ideas that, as you say, are not necessarily very costly. Let's look at what we can do and what results we would get from that and how from there on we could move forward. Then also, I think when we talk about political will, I think political will is also the will to put money towards the goal and to recognize that the population that we're talking about, the people that we're talking about, the children that we're talking about, are paying a really high cost, high price for the fact that they are being left behind, and that cost should really outweigh any financial cost that it would sort of like take to include them. So I think those are the, yeah, I think it's very important.
I'm about to say something that might be a little bit controversial with some groups, and I'm not a statistician, so I'm wading into dangerous territory, but it's based on some of the discussions I've heard in the last 2 days. One of the things that I think is important to consider in thinking about how to answer or deal with those trade-offs is that the one particular trade-off that we're talking about here, it's multidimensional, so it's not actually one, but this disaggregation challenge of getting, the lower down you go, say, in geographic area, looking at a particular group, then that same sample, which was quite robust at one level, becomes much less robust, and do you have the money to invest? I think in the context of what we're talking about here and kind of a transformational sustainable development agenda is that we're not talking about that trade-off in a vacuum. And I've actually heard a few people talking about, well, some of the more traditional methods that have been used are appropriate for certain purposes and points in time, but we might not need to be relying on them for everything, such that we might be in a situation where we reduce our spending on some of the heavier, more labor or cost-intensive methods, the frequency of them, or the labor intensity of them. There might be other ways to lessen the economic or the resource burden there so that more resource can be put toward some of those more complex challenges, at the same time building on some more experimental or innovative approaches. I'm afraid I can't be more precise on that. It's more of an instinct than anything else. But I think we need to be a little bit, open the aperture to that question of trade-offs and look at the different pieces and the resource allocations across a range of measurement challenges, rather than looking at it by itself.
Yeah, if I could just add another point is, the way I view this is it is a cup half full scenario, and I would not think of it as a zero-sum game, that if resources go in, quote, trying to shine light on the missing millions, that other resources have to go down. Because in what we're experiencing is that there are a lot of donors interested in this issue who are not the traditional ones that have been supporting the big, DHS mix, those types of surveys. And, those surveys are so critical, going forward for the SDGs, just like they were for the MDGs. And, there's so much opportunity to continually improve their reach and abilities to do things. But again, it's not a zero-sum game. I think there's a lot of opportunities from foundations, from the private sector, and it's a doable challenge, in my view.
Yeah, thanks. Just to point out in my closing remarks that I think that included in the missing millions are the elites. We have the power brokers, we have the members of parliament, and many other powerful people within countries, people who control not only political power, but resources. And when you look at this conference, for example, you're not seeing them. So we're talking about trying to provide local solutions, trying to find domestic resources, and the people who are supposed to be, here, listening to the narrative about the data revolution are not here. So that's a missing link, and we'll continue to talk like this, and then when we go home, the actual decision makers do what they want, because they're completely unaware about what you're talking about. So we do have an opportunity through, I think one of the best taglines you can ever have for any global development discourse: leave no one behind. I think that's very powerful. It provides the framework and the opportunity to drag all these people into the conversation and ensure that as we talk about the solutions, they're on the table to be part of the conversation, but also understand that they're a bigger part of the problem, and they need to be part of the solution and provide the resources that can actually transform people's lives.
Rebecca or Phyllis, any final thoughts from you on this?
Just that I agree with you. I think there are things that we can do and estimates we can make. In an earlier session, we were being told to be bold and model things from data that we have. And I think we should come up with estimates and let countries challenge them and do them better if they can.
Yeah, and I just also wanted to echo Rick's point that we have also seen some kind of slightly less typical donors coming forward in this type of problem. From a HOT perspective, that's partially because we have a kind of volunteering opportunity that, corporates who are kind of companies who want to get their workforce involved in volunteering and create that dimension for their company might not typically support an agenda like this, but would do if they're kind of participating in a project from that perspective. And then I guess from the other side, from the mapping that we do, by itself, it doesn't give kind of, the information that you would need to measure against an SDG. You need to have some kind of driving reason why you're doing that mapping and, a partner who would be measuring things locally. But there is a huge amount that you can do, which is basically free. The entire HOT community grew incredibly organically from a volunteer base. It had no funding, it had no formal kind of recognition, and it became the NGO that it is now. And so whilst we do some projects that are funded, that kind of operate in a slightly different way, we also have loads of partners who, there is no financial exchange whatsoever, and we have volunteers who set up mapping events around the world who map 500,000 people every year. And that's a really amazing thing for kind of individuals and citizens to be able to say that they do, when actually, like, they work in an office in a developed country and their day-to-day job has absolutely nothing to do with contributing towards the SDGs. So I think there are some kind of ways that we'll harness those people and use those people to sort of move more towards this agenda.
Great. Thank you so much to all of you that stuck it out at the end of day 2 of the UN Data Forum. I think that even though we were small, we were indeed mighty in terms of the conversation quality. I think we've covered a lot of the different pieces of this agenda. I mean, certainly as Rebecca ended us off on a really nice positive note, that there are glimmers of examples of innovative approaches, new types of donors and partners that are emerging that haven't really been into the fore before, that are coming around this issue. But the challenges are clear when it comes to the politics of actually getting governments on board, the reversing the inertia of people doing what they always do when it comes to data collection, thinking about the resource constraints and how you balance all of these things, and then all of the technical challenges therein. We hope that this is only we hope that this is the start of a conversation, and we hope that it continues. I know the Global Partnership is very interested in this area. We're hoping to have future conversations. So please stay tuned. Come up and chat with us afterwards if you like. But thanks to all of you, and have a good night. And thanks to our panelists. Let's give them a round of applause.